So our next agenda item today is a presentation from the Star Voting team with Sara Wolk. Sara, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Hello. Good to see you all again, and thanks for having me back. And yeah, interesting presentation from the last presenter as well. He did a great job, and there's a ton of intersection there because we're pretty much engaging in one of those processes right now as we talk about voting reform and districting and all of these moving pieces. So I've got another slideshow ready for you guys, this time on star voting. So again, I'm Sara Wolk. I'm the executive director for the Equal Vote Coalition, but today I'm going to talk about star voting in particular. And if you have any questions, especially clarifying questions, please don't hesitate to jump in and ask them in the middle, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end too. So star voting, the idea is that you should be able to vote your conscience, that no vote should be wasted. We should get good representative outcomes, have good accountability over those who we do elect into office. We should have good accessibility to office, to running for office. We should level the playing field. We want it transparent. We want to have a system with integrity. And of course, we want equality. So, star voting, I'm going to start off telling a little bit of the origin story of star voting and how it was invented, how it came to be one of these leading proposals that is under consideration these days. So in 2014, the Equal Vote Coalition hosted a conference on electoral reform at the University of Oregon. Advocates for the leading voting methods came together to present and discuss the options. Each group had their most important goals prioritized, but none of the proposals on the table could deliver on all these goals, and each proposal had its drawbacks. So on one side of the debate, we had advocates for scoring voting type scoring systems, systems where you're adding up the votes or you're adding up the scores, and the person with the most scores, most approvals, whatever, wins. And on the other side, we had advocates of ranked runoff type systems, where you're showing preference order, you're doing tabulation in rounds, and you're using vote transfers to try and find a majority. So both proposals had their pros, both had their cons, both had deal breakers that the other side wasn't willing to compromise on. But the conversation sparked an idea. Could a hybrid proposal combine the best elements of previous proposals to deliver better results while addressing these valid concerns with the older methods? So the revelation there was that a 5-star ballot includes not only your level of support, but also allows you to show your preference order. So you could count a star ballot adding up the stars, but you could also count a star ballot as if it were rankings for preference order. And that's really exactly what star voting is. So score voting is the first round. You score the candidates up to 5 stars. The candidates with the most stars overall advance to the runoff. And then the instant runoff works just like an instant runoff does in ranked choice voting, where your vote goes to the finalist you prefer. And your ballot already shows which finalist you prefer because a 5-star ballot can show preference order. So really it's a hybrid of the two kind of warring factions of the voting reform movement, and does deliver kind of more than the sum of its parts. So STAR stands for score then automatic runoff. And that is exactly how it works. We would call it score then instant runoff, except then the acronym is STIR voting, which just doesn't sound as great. So with STAR voting, you give your favorite 5 stars, you give your last choice 0 stars, You show your preference order and your level of support for the candidates. Equal scores can be given to indicate no preference, such as here between Andre and David. Both of them got 4 stars. The voter likes them both equally. And those who are left blank will receive a 0. This voter decided to fill in their 0 bubble for Blake, which can be cathartic, but if you just leave it blank, that person will receive a 0 just the same. With star voting, you only have to vote once, and the ballots are counted in a 2-step process. First, we've got the scoring round, where the 2 highest scoring candidates advance to the runoff and are finalists. Then we've got an automatic runoff, where your vote automatically goes to the finalist you scored higher. The finalist preferred by the majority wins. Here is a different election from what I showed you last week, again showing results for star voting. So stars tallied in 2 rounds. First, you add up the stars, as we see in this first column under total scores. And in this election, it was a presidential nomination poll for the Libertarian Party. They had 2,909 voters. Justin Amash got 8,018. Vermin Supreme, real candidate, I swear, got 7,220 votes. They advanced to the runoff. 1,404 preferred Justin Amash. 1,138 preferred Vermin Supreme. And that is basically a 55-45 split between these 2 finalists. So very clear, very straightforward. One more thing that I want to add here is that with star voting, your 2 rounds are counted in fundamentally different ways. So the first round is measuring candidate quality. How much overall does the electorate like this candidate? How much support do they have? And then the second round is measuring quantity of supporters. How many individual people actually prefer one over the other? So the age-old debate of, is it more important to have quality? Is it more important to measure quantity? With star voting, you get both. And you really get both from these 2 different stages. So in the first round, I'm going to talk about the advantages of just using a 5-star ballot. So for starters, a 5-star ballot allows voters to easily show both preference order and level of support. And I don't mean to repeat myself, but this is kind of a breakthrough in voting. So for voters in a ranked method, for example, I'm able to show my first choice, second choice, third choice, but I have no way to show that my second choice is as good as my favorite. I actually love them both. Or that my second choice is actually a lesser evil who I really don't support, but I prefer them over somebody even worse that's on the ballot. Next, star voting is best for cognitive load. So cognitive load is the idea that humans have a certain kind of a limited capacity for information all at once. We like to have options, we like to have some variety, it's the spice of life, but past a certain amount of variety of options on our plate, we can get overwhelmed, we can get bogged down. And when we do get overloaded, we start to make more errors. We start to rely on things like stereotypes. We stop making nuanced, good decisions, and basically quality of whatever we're doing starts to suffer. So for voters, we want them to be able to make good quality assessments of the candidates, get their opinions on paper, and do a good job. We don't want to have spoiled ballots, which are, ballots that are accidentally voided because somebody messed up. We really want voters to be able to do a good job. And many studies have looked at what is the threshold for cognitive load for humans? And the sweet spot really is around 5 to 7 options. So star voting really fits perfectly in there where voters have as much choice as they can handle, but not so much that it's going to be crippling. And again, the 5-star ballot, like a 5-star rating, everyone is familiar with this format. Everyone's familiar with filling out bubbles like Scantron, and votes are tallied with simple addition. So nothing here is really new or complex. And then getting to the advantages of having a top 2 automatic runoff. This actually works a lot like, most local elections in Oregon, where you have a bunch of candidates in a primary, you advance the top 2 to the general election, and you select a winner. But you don't have to host 2 whole separate elections. You don't have to pay for 2 separate elections. Candidates don't have to run twice, which running for office is a ton of work, and a huge barrier for working class people. So with a top 2 automatic runoff, the advantage that we're getting over just having the highest scoring candidate win is that with star voting, honesty is the best policy. We give 5 stars to our favorites. We show our honest preference order between the other candidates. So that's the behavior that's incentivized. And it's incentivized because your vote automatically goes to the finalist you prefer. If your favorite can't win, your vote still makes a difference. And no matter what scores you gave to the finalists, your 1 full vote goes to the finalist you prefer.
Hey, Sarah, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. You talked about cognitive load, and it made me think about the number of items that we're considering putting on the ballot for voters.
Absolutely.
Was your research or your statement specifically about the number of candidates on a star ballot and having to make decisions around candidates, or was that more research that was more broadly applicable to other things as well?
It's very broadly applicable. So here we're using it to say, how many scores is too many? Should we do 0 through 100? Should we do 0 through 10? No, 0 through 5 is really the sweet spot. But in terms of if you were going to have a primary in advance, a bunch of candidates to the general election, having more than 5 to 7 candidates in one election, you start having drop-offs in voters' ability to research the candidates. And, for a commission like you guys, if you need to spend your allotted time researching 15 really important, separately technical items all at once, you're going to get diminishing returns than if you were able to focus on 3 action items or 5. And definitely if you put a bunch of things on the ballot all at once, people are going to have less time to research each and will probably default to, no change. I think when people are overwhelmed, they're more conservative. When people feel confident in their own abilities, they're more open-minded in general. So yeah, lots of applications for that. Yeah, and interestingly, the original proposal for star voting, it wasn't called star, and it was a 0 through 9 star ballot. And we actually did a bunch of statistical analysis and realized that we were getting just as good of results with a 5-star ballot without it being so confusing to look at. So that was actually a carefully selected detail, not just a chance. But it is convenient that we have these 5 fingers, and 5's a nice round number. So another consideration for voting reform is combating strategic voting. And there's really 2 sides to what does it mean to combat strategic voting. On the one side, we've got ensuring that it's safe to support your favorite. So in our current system and in ranked choice voting, it's not necessarily safe to vote for your favorite. voters who don't want to waste their vote on a candidate who can't win. Voters don't want to waste their vote on a candidate who can't win. So voting for the lesser of two evils is a common practice. In star voting, you should always give your honest favorite 5 stars. And that's why it says that on the instructions. And then the other piece of the puzzle is, yeah, we want people to be able to support their honest favorite, but we also want to incentivize voters to show their honest preference order, to show their opinion on other candidates beyond their favorite. So in star voting, the runoff creates strong incentives for voters to show their preference order between candidates, because no matter who makes it to the runoff, you want your vote to go to the finalist you prefer. So you need to show who you prefer. Showing your preference order between frontrunners ensures that your vote makes a difference in the runoff. So strategic voting is something that's been studied a ton, and there's a little bit of bad news from the experts here. It's been proven with the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem that no voting method can eliminate strategic incentives in every single scenario. So there are dozens of voting method criteria out there, and another proof that won Kenneth Arrow the Nobel Prize showed that no voting method can pass all of these desirable criteria. The good news is that these criteria are pass-fail, but if we look at these same criteria through a more nuanced lens, we can find voting methods that get good grades across the board. So while it might be impossible to guarantee that 100% of the time you should give your favorite 5 stars, we can make sure that that is true in practice. While some voters might not have a perfect incentive to show their full preference order in every single near tie scenario, if they had godlike polling and information about what every other voter is going to do, we can make it so that strategic voting is not actionable, it's not incentivized, and it's not something that people need to worry about. So down to the third bullet point down here, many criteria are mutually exclusive. So these 2 columns are referencing 2 separate criteria. One is the favorite betrayal criteria, which says that it is that voting for your favorite can never backfire. And the other is later no harm criteria, that showing support for other candidates beyond your favorite can never backfire. And it's impossible to pass both, it turns out. But star voting does a really good job at maximizing both. So the goal really is to ensure good incentives and good outcomes in practice. Star voting is really the next generation in voting reform. So all of this math and science has been studied extensively. And what we found is that star voting tops the charts in every study and statistical analysis of voting method accuracy. The star ballot itself collects the best quality data possible on voter opinion. And then it uses all that data, all of it's counted. No ballot data is wasted or ignored. Every ballot is counted in both rounds, both the scoring round, you add up all the stars. In the runoff round, you count all the votes for each finalist. The scoring round measures level of support, how much do voters like each candidate, and the automatic runoff measures number of supporters, how many voters prefer each finalist. And star voting eliminates vote splitting and the spoiler effect, and guarantees that the voting method passes the highest bar for one person, one vote. So getting into the theory for this stuff is some of my favorite. Interestingly, the invention of star voting was really predicted by a study that was conducted in the year 2000 called Bayesian regret, which showed that score voting when combined with a top 2 runoff, was the best at electing the candidate who best represents the will of the people. So score voting with a top 2 runoff is really just star voting separated out into 2 elections. And so that was the finding that really inspired this idea in the first place, 14 years before it was officially invented. And then another really exciting tidbit here is that the legal definition of one person, one vote requires ensuring an equally weighted vote, which can only be done by eliminating vote splitting. So the Supreme Court ruled in a case about gerrymandering that was part of the Voting Rights Act in 1964, that the weight and worth of each citizen's vote, as nearly as is practicable, should be equal. And any voting method that allows you to give your full support to all the candidates on your side, and to show I prefer all of these good guys, however many of them there are, that is really the key to ensuring that my vote is just as powerful as yours, even if you only have one candidate on your side. So there's a great article that goes over all of this in tons of detail at the Star Voting website under starvoting.us/accuracy. And if you scroll down to the very end of that, you can see all of the many studies that have included star voting, and also a number of the studies that set the stage for modern voting theory and electoral science. It's good stuff. So moving on from discussion about single winner, I know that you guys have talked a lot about proportional representation. And so I want to get into that and kind of go over the fundamentals. So what is proportional representation? Proportional representation is a type of multi-winner election where factions win seats proportionate to their supporters. So here we have this kind of rainbow of people who got elected to this council. And we've got, on the left, we've got kind of a breakdown of the demographics of the population. So we've got the pink party, who represents 25% of the vote, the yellow party, which represents 33% of the vote, the teal party, which also has 25% of the vote, and the green party, which has 17% of the vote. In this example, there are 12 seats available on council. So a faction would only need 1/12 of the voters' support to ensure they win a seat. Any type of ballot can be used to get proportional representation. So whether or not you want single winner districts or proportional representation, you could do that with star voting by using proportional star for your multi-member or multi-winner elections. If you went with ranked choice, that would be the single transferable vote. And if you went with approval voting, which again is under consideration in Seattle, the proportional version of that is called proportional approval. But one thing to keep in mind is that while proportional representation is more complex and there are less resources kind of comparing the different options that are accessible for lay people, most considerations comparing single winner methods still hold when you're comparing their proportional counterparts. So that's why we mostly focus on comparing and contrasting single winner voting methods, just because it's a lot easier to wrap your head around and it all mostly applies. But this next slide gets into kind of setting the stage and laying the framing for what proportional representation is compared to other types of representation. So we really have 2 types of representation, and it's helpful to look at it as a spectrum. So if you look at the top of this slide, on the left, we've got local representation, that's local geographical representation. And we've got single winner elections and single winner districts, over on that side as well. On the right, we've got proportional representation, which is proportional ideological representation. And we've got proportional representation, or PR, in at-large elections citywide or jurisdiction-wide at that end of the spectrum as well. And yeah, at-large elections with PR really maximize that. And since this is a lot to look at and this font is small, I actually broke this slide down into a few sub-slides. So here we have it slightly bigger with more information on this top spectrum. So local representation and proportional representation are best visualized as a continuum. Proportionate geographical representation and ideologically proportional representation are inversely correlated. So what that means is that if you increase the level of local proportionate geographical representation, you decrease the assurance that you're going to get ideological proportional representation, and vice versa. Increasing one requires decreasing the other. Local representation in single winner districts is perfectly geographically proportionate. Sorry about that typo there. So local representation ensures that every voter has a representative and that every area has equal representation. For proportional representation to deliver its most ideologically diverse results, it requires a large number of winners in each race. So advocates of proportional representation generally recommend expanding city council sizes significantly and then electing winners at large or in larger multi-member districts to keep the number of votes required for a candidate to win as low as possible. And I'm just going to rewind here quickly so we can look at this rainbow spectrum of council one more time. So what we're seeing here is that because this election has 12 seats available, a faction only needs 1/12 of the voter support to ensure they win a seat. So that's 8% of the vote. So what that means is that 92% of voters could oppose this person over here, and they would still be able to win because they're representing their faction really well.
May I ask a quick question on that previous
Yeah.
slide?
Sure.
I had trouble wrapping my head around the second bullet point, the inverse relationship between proportional geographic and ideological proportional representation.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just the time of the day and I need some chocolate or what's going on, but I would love if you could help me to understand that, please.
Yeah. The good news is that I'm actually working on editing a book that covers this topic in depth. The bad news is that it's even more confusing and long and wonky than what I just shared with you. So if you picture on one side local representation in districts, you've got each district, let's say East Gresham, is electing one person who best represents East Gresham. That's going to guarantee that East Gresham has one representative on council, and it's going to guarantee that a voter in East Gresham will have a representative. They can go to their East Gresham representative and schedule a meeting and then either vote for them if they like what they hear or vote against them if they don't like what they're hearing. So that's the single winner local representation side of the spectrum. But if we do proportional representation at large, you're electing by the whole city. And so that means that geographically, you could get everyone from North Gresham elected. But you are ensuring that you have that ideological proportionate representation. So you've got somebody representing each ideological faction. That part's really well represented and that part's guaranteed, but you have no guarantee that the local distribution is represented. And the same would go with anything kind of proportional. Like a good example, I think, is, let's say we're trying to select a citizen or lottery commission to work on our districting or something. And we want 50% to be renters. We want 50% to be homeowners. We want, 20% to be, over 60, 20% to be in each age bracket or whatever. You can only guarantee one of those types of proportionate things. You can't guarantee all of them because it just becomes impossible.
So can I do a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
If we do a mix of some seats from districts and some at-large seats, does this problem go away or at least get partially dealt with?
So, yes. What that would be is kind of picking the best of both worlds and doing a hybrid that's some of both. And that is traditionally how proportional representation is done. So countries that use it proportionally for national elections, like Australia, they use it for the Senate, but not the House, for example. So they'll get both kinds of representation by doing, half the seats with one system and half with the other. So that is a totally valid, historically normal approach. And then the other way you could kind of split the difference is to pick somewhere in the middle of the spectrum where you have less local representation. Your districts aren't as small. Maybe you don't have someone for each neighborhood, but you have someone for at least each side of town. So that's where multi-member districts come into play, and multi-member districts can be done with basic multi-winner without doing proportional representation, or with proportional representation in multi-member districts. So yeah, hopefully this little spectrum can be good to reference back to say, okay, which ones fit where on the spectrum. And yeah, so I think most people would choose to either pick one system from the middle or would pick a hybrid of the two, or would choose to keep it simple and stick to the left, or be really expressive and innovative and go all the way to the right. And my next slide goes into the pros and cons of why you might choose those. So, pros of local representation. Local representation guarantees a local representative from each part of town. Historically, this is best for electing people of color. Campaigns generally cost less for candidates in smaller districts. Smaller districts are better for a grassroots campaign style with volunteers and are great for door knocking. Each voter will have a specific representative that they can vote for, go to when they have input that they want to share, or vote out if needed. And local representation in terms of officiation is very simple, super transparent, and it's the cheapest and easiest to run. So you'll keep your elections officials happy with this option. And your taxpayers. The cons, though, are that there's absolutely no guarantee of ideological diversity on council. You could get every single person from the same political party. You could get, all women or all men. You could get all renters or all homeowners. There's really no guarantee. It's up to each local area to decide what they want in a representative. And there's less incentive to appeal to smaller factions who don't have a majority in a district. So if I'm running in East Gresham, and I know that I've got the majority support, I really can kind of ignore the people who didn't vote for me. To an extent, I still need to keep enough people happy to win my majority re-election. But beyond that, yeah, not a ton of incentive to appeal to the people who didn't vote for me. So for pros and cons of proportional representation, it's important to keep in mind not each bullet point is like equally weighted. Some are more important than others, and that's up to you guys. But so this first one is absolutely paramount for lots of people, and they love that proportional representation helps ensure diversity of ideas and diversity of ideology. So the easiest way to think about it is partisan elections in like a multi-party system, because that would proportionally have all these ideologies represented. But if you adopt it here, even though we don't have a multi-party system, and even though they're nonpartisan elections, you would still get those types of outcomes. So it can be helpful for visualizing. But proportional representation gives smaller factions a seat at the table. And having diverse voices at the table can be really transformative to ensure that you're not missing the elephant in the room, that you're considering people's lived experience, and so on. Proportional representation, especially at a national level, can help break two-party domination. So that's nice as well for people who want to see a more full spectrum of people represented. The cons are that voters don't have one specific representative, even though my vote, my faction helped elect somebody who I agree with. I don't actually have a direct link to know this is the person that my vote went to elect. It can be very difficult to vote somebody out of office if they're toxic, or somebody toxic out of office, even if they're opposed by a supermajority. So again, in an election, if there's 12 people, 12 seats available, you could have somebody who's opposed by 92% of the people that still is winning re-election. And you're platforming that person. So proportional representation historically has had issues with electing and then insulating more polarizing candidates. And that's a whole historical can of worms, subject of years of study and many books. But especially when it's adopted with really low thresholds. So that's not as big an issue if you're only electing 3 seats in a multi-member district, because then you need a full third of voters to support you. It's a much bigger issue if you're electing 100 people, so you only need 1% of the vote to win. Because so many factions can get seats at the table, it may lead to more stagnated governments, and different factions that aren't forming cohesive coalitions and aren't able to work together as well. So there's a bit of a correlation there, and it totally depends on the country if they've had those issues or not. So again, implementation details really make a difference for these types of, this whole middle of the cons bullet point zone. But in general, proportional representation has pretty opaque tabulation. It's perhaps impossible for a layperson to understand how it's really tabulated for any of the proposals that you've been pitched so far. You pretty much need a computer to do it. And it's expensive and difficult to implement. Another consideration that isn't an issue for Gresham is that laws prohibiting centralized tabulation would need to be repealed, before proportional representation could be implemented at larger scales. So we wouldn't be able to use this as kind of a pilot project for statewide or national elections because we're not allowed to tabulate votes centrally for the whole state. We do it by county. And same with, we don't want our ballots all mailed to Washington, D.C. to be tabulated. We want to be able to tabulate Oregon ballots here in Oregon. So I'm just going to pause really briefly and see if you have any questions, more questions about that section before I get to the next little chunk. But we're almost to the end. Go for it, Jack.
I'm really struggling with the idea of 12% of the people electing one of a 12-member council. We've had a historic high percentage of people that were elected by plurality of votes. And we also have a record of 20 to 30% of undervoting over many, many years. And a friend of mine, a former counselor, used to listen to the neighbors complain about their car got stolen or whatnot. And he said, well, why don't you talk to your city councilor? Who is that? And nobody has a clue. And I'm wondering if those are not all interrelated, and I don't know quite how to process that. Any thoughts?
They're hard questions, and I don't think there's right and wrong answers. There's really important pros and cons on both sides, and that's why this isn't a solved question. We're not the first people to try and grapple with these issues, but I did want to make sure that you guys had the pros and cons so that you know about them before you say, the pros are really great, because the pros are really great for both sides. And so on that issue, we don't have a recommendation, but on the rest of it, we do. So I'm going to finish on an easier note for you guys and get us a bit out of the weeds. All right, so back to the screen share. Where are we? So here's a beautiful map of Gresham. And districting is important. So regardless what voting method you choose, Gresham is large enough, it's the second largest city in Oregon, I believe, that you should break it into districts to ensure some level, at least, of local representation, and also to eliminate barriers to entry. Districts should be small enough to ensure local representation, but large enough to ensure competitive elections. So if you had a district for every single neighborhood, you might have a hard time finding enough candidates to run for each one of these. So that would probably be an example of too many districts. So the way you would figure this out is you say, how many people do we want on our council? And then break it into districts that would have up to 5, ideally, good competitive candidates to choose between. That would be like a perfect way to kind of calculate how many districts you want. So studies are very clear that electing winners at large, which is how you currently do it, citywide, is worse for candidates of color. And these studies are also very clear that smaller districts are better for candidates of color, for working class candidates, for candidates with less funding, and for candidates campaigning with volunteers and doing door knocking. And I posted a source here. This is a study that looked at a bunch of other studies to kind of compile the results into one great resource.
Sarah, may I interrupt you one more time?
Sure.
Thank you for mentioning that it was okay to ask questions throughout your presentation. On that previous slide, the second bullet,
yeah,
you mentioned figuring out there was some advice around figuring out how the size of the districts.
Yeah.
Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, sure. So you want your districts to be as small as possible to ensure good local representation, but big enough that they're competitive. So if you know how many seats are available, how many people are on council overall, and you know how many people run for office typically citywide, then you can kind of split that into elections with 5 or so candidates. And that's a pretty good just rule of thumb to see, like, if we had 4 districts for 4 quadrants of Gresham, would we have a competitive election in each of those? Or do we need to have more districts or less to keep that around that 5 candidate, 5, 6, 7 candidate threshold for good cognitive load?
So we wouldn't be moving to districts if we had that data. We don't have enough people running for office currently. There's a lot of them that are uncontested, even with the current situation that we have. So we don't have that history to go on. Do you have any advice on how we might start thinking about it without that data?
Well, I do, but I don't think I could cover it really quickly. But if you want to send me an email, I could follow up with some more on that point for sure. It's a little bit out of the scope of what I'm really an expert into. So those are good questions to put to a citizen lottery or a citizen assembly, or a community lottery that would look at districting. I think that's a great idea for this type of question, especially. So last thing I just wanted to touch on is primaries. So primaries are needed currently because our voting method is wildly inaccurate with more than 2 candidates in the race. And we see this on this chart on the left, which is one of the classic seminal studies on voting method accuracy. And what it shows is that with 2 candidates in the race, you have 100% accurate elections across the board, no matter what voting method you use. But as we add more candidates, plurality, just the candidate with the most votes wins, sees really a pretty horrific drop off in representative outcomes. And it gets better if you add a top 2 general election, which is this blue line. It's a little better if you add the instant runoff method, but you really need to get to voting methods that eliminate vote splitting if you want to see, if you don't want those kinds of drop-offs when you have more candidates. And having a better voting method should actually help you have more competitive elections and more voter engagement, because currently a lot of people do check out and feel like they're not going to make a difference, so why get involved? Better voting does help with turnout for candidates, so that's something to look forward to. But yeah, second bullet point here, accuracy of election results deteriorates dramatically with voting methods that suffer from vote splitting, including plurality voting and top 2 runoff. Ranked choice voting also, ranked choice voting advocates claim otherwise, so watch out for that. But IRV does also suffer from vote splitting and tests only marginally better than top 2 in larger fields of candidates, which sounds like that's not your problem, but hopefully someday it will be. Gotta plan for the future. There are many benefits to skipping the primary, especially if you do have not a ton of candidates, and just having one election for local offices is another big advantage, as long as the election's accuracy won't suffer from doing so. And most modern voting methods, including star voting, eliminate vote splitting and allow the primary to be skipped without sacrificing results. So the crux of the matter, this chart looks at a handful of voting methods across the top: current system, ranked choice, approval, better ranked method called ranked robin, and then star voting. And then it looks at things like, does the voting method have vote splitting? Does it advantage some types of candidates? How about wasted votes or exhausted ballots? Can ballots be tabulated locally? Does it require centralized tabulation? How complex is the tabulation? Do we need a primary for this method? How accurate is this method according to voter satisfaction efficiency, which is one of the best metrics? And then how does it fare in terms of strategic voting incentives? Are we incentivizing strategic voting? Are we incentivizing honest voting? And I won't read this whole chart out loud to you guys, but I did include it because I think it's a really good reference of some important considerations, and also just at a glance, how did these voting methods compare side to side? And of course, it's color coded, so at a glance, green is good. So kind of in conclusion here, star voting is quite adaptable. No matter what other considerations you decide or are looking at, whether you want to go with single winner proportional representation, whether you have nonpartisan elections or want to switch to partisan ones, or you want to have primaries or not, no matter what you decide on districting, star voting is compatible. And it's also compatible with all of the current standards for election integrity, and also some standards that we electoral reform nerds are hoping to see in the future. So it doesn't require centralized tabulation is huge for scalability of a voting reform and national viability. Hopefully this won't be something that's just adopted by cities in Oregon, but could be, adopted all over the country and world. And it's fully auditable. No new voting machines or hardware is required. I didn't get into cost at all, but cost for star voting is doable. It's not no expense, but eliminating the primary could also save money. So in the long run, it could be a cost savings with some initial expense, especially on voter education. Totally great for vote by mail, and you get quick, same day, transparent results. So we're working on it all over the country. We have lots underway, and hopefully if Gresham does decide to do this, you wouldn't be first. But if you were first, that would be a point of pride. And yeah, so sorry, I took up kind of a lot of time there and didn't leave a ton of time for more questions, but.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Jack, is your hand up?
I watched the video that you submitted relative to your discussion at the City of Portland.
Yeah.
And in there was a question about why would you go with star voting when it's never been tried, quote unquote. And the answer was because nobody does it. And that's the reason why you don't want to do it. And that's the sense I got from it. I hope I paraphrased that relatively correctly. And that didn't make sense to me. How would you respond?
Necessity is the mother of invention. If in general, in the modern era, we value progress, we value innovation, and we value our ability as a society to do better than we've ever done before. So I think we should apply that spirit of innovation to elections, and we should be open to new ideas, especially if those new ideas are really vetted at a high level. So if we're going to build a new giant skyscraper in downtown Gresham, we no longer need to just start stacking bricks and see if it falls down. We can run it by architects, we can run it by engineers, and we can make sure we have a solid proposal before we roll it out. And so the idea that we need to have done it to be allowed to do it, it just is a catch-22. Yeah, Chris. Or Jack. But Chris,
I was going to call on Member Dressel. That was all.
Thanks.
So everything looks fantastic to me. I really like the approach to star voting. I think it's very innovative, and I think it could fix a lot of the problems we're currently seeing with all the methods we use for voting. One of the things I have to think of, though, is when we developed the system we're currently using and everything, obviously committees were drawn, people were pulled together, everybody said, hey, this is why we want what we want. And they didn't foresee challenges today that we've run into. What could potentially happen, like if the city council changes something in how the districts are drawn, or things are gerrymandered, or if this gets adopted, statewide or nationally, what laws or what speed bumps could you see that could potentially be put in place by people who are opposing this to make it look bad, that we can look for now, or that we can speak to now to prepare for, so that we don't run into those things in the future?
Good question. Yeah, it's hard to anticipate every possible roadblock. The one that first comes to mind is like legal concerns or legal viability. And we've seen that come up for other reforms, like a bunch of states just banned ranked choice voting. Tennessee, Florida, there's a bill in California. Texas did it first. But ranked choice voting already wasn't constitutional in most of New England. And so even states that have adopted it have been grappling with that. And the miraculous thing, star voting wasn't designed to be constitutional, and every state's constitution is different, but it pretty much complies no matter how it's written. So a lot of laws require your one vote to go to one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. That's really common legal terminology. Or win by plurality, which means the exact same thing. And with star voting in the runoff, your vote is your one ballot, and your ballot counts for the finalist you prefer. So it already does comply. So everywhere that ranked choice voting isn't legal currently, star voting already is. And then another thing that a lot of jurisdictions struggle with is there's language in their laws that require a win by majority. And this is definitely true of like the Democratic Party of Oregon and different groups that have adopted star voting. Star voting also ensures a win by majority because of that runoff. The candidate with who's preferred, the finalist preferred by the majority wins out of all voters who had a preference. So that's as much as you can possibly comply with that. So I think it's very robust and defensible. And I think that's one of the reasons we're fighting for it so hard, is just that the previous proposals, people were able to poke holes in them and there are valid concerns. And we're like, well, rather than just say your concerns aren't valid, this is better, we would rather have a proposal that really can stand up to criticism. And that does require a new thing.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. Does anyone have one more question for Sarah? We have just a couple more minutes. I guess we can also go over if there's a bunch of questions for Sarah. Okay. I'm not seeing anything. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for your presentation.
Thank you guys so much. You're doing an incredible job, and it's really an honor to get to present and have your ear and share all this information. So feel free to shoot me emails if you have follow-up questions or concerns anytime, or if you want me or anyone else, if you get sick of hearing my voice from our organization, other people could come too. But people, it's pretty jam-packed right now. So I'm glad I got to come back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And on districting, preventing gerrymandering, and citizen assemblies or lottery selected panels, we actually have a proposal for that drafted up, just not super in depth, but a couple of paragraphs on what we recommend for that. And I remember getting a question about that last week. So I'll send you guys that as well, because
Thank you. That would be welcome.
an off topic for me, but relevant for you guys bit of information.
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. All right, cheers.